just let the power go off on, not the
Okay,
hard
well.
switch. So, yeah, we're good. We got it all set up. Brought the Bluetooth speaker today, so we can have a little better sound quality.
Oh, my wife will never be here, she'll be lost.
She knows where we're at.
Oh, she does?
Yeah, I love her.
Oh, wow, same, huh?
Yeah, the angles.
Got you all choked up.
Wow,
Wow, he's right,
they're trailing off.
man.
Oh, well, it's the time change,
I
right?
think so.
I expected a number of people may not make it because of that.
I know one for sure is at the service for new member class.
Oh, okay. Alright. Yeah, I'm sure the time changed, especially with probably family with younger kids. Let them sleep in a little.
So Jeff, you've read a little bit of Michael Behe along the way.
Yeah,
What do you think of his view?
well, I think his science is great. I think, like his irreducible complexity arguments.
I see that you've got that.
And we're gonna do that, probably we'll get to it next, well, we won't get to it today. We'll do it next week for sure.
Well, I thought no class next week. right?
I'm sorry, yes, in 2 weeks we'll do that.
Yeah.
The next time we have class. You know, I think where, you know, that's all part of the intelligent design movement.
It is, yeah.
And I think they do a great job of being credentialed
Mhm.
scientists,
Right.
doing really good science.
Yeah.
But most of them, well, at least from what I can tell, it's not like I know it, from what I can read, most of them still don't take what I would say is a literal interpretation of the Bible.
I actually saw Michael Behe in person in Cranbrook about 10 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a guy from Highland Park named Rick Warren, not the Rick Warren from Saddleback
Right.
Church who wrote Purpose Driven Life, he funded it. And they had a U of M professor, Michael Behe. They had a few of these. One was on global warming that they brought NASA.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating. But I got a sense that Behe was trying to make people really challenge the evolutionary thing without giving them the baggage of saying, thus you must believe this.
I think
So his whole point is, I want people to have to challenge that there's something, because his whole view is, he thinks there's a creator behind all this.
Correct.
And I don't know if he writes that in his writing, but he did say that in the presentation.
Yeah, I think it comes, that whole ID movement, I think their whole goal is trying to keep the argument focused on the science.
Mhm.
Take the, you know, this, as soon as you start bringing religion and God in, then the evolutionary scientists will be like, well, you gotta keep science and religion separate. You're just talking religion, we can't even talk about it. And so, yeah, that whole movement is attempting to focus on the science. But they run into a problem because as soon as they say, what's the intelligent designer? I don't know if they run into a problem, but, you know, what is the intelligent designer? Is it space aliens? Is it a creator God? Is it, you know, what is it? And then they I think they stumble a little bit because they won't answer that.
Right, it's a deliberate thing.
And it's a deliberate thing.
Yeah, Michael Behe, it was clear it was deliberate.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it is a deliberate thing. But even I just read something yesterday that came through, it was criticizing Behe, that, you know, he still, from what this article was saying, he still would acknowledge that there is some type of, I don't know if evolutionary process is the right word, but there's some kind of mechanism that has created the diversity. And to my knowledge, he hasn't come out and said that diversity is the result of God, right? And so when you don't say that, then what is the result of the diversity then? And if you're not going to say it's evolutionary process, then you're left with, and that's what this article is saying. Hey, you're not saying it's evolutionary process, Behe, but it's not God in your world because you haven't said that. So what is it? And then unfortunately he loses a little credibility, I think, because he hasn't posited another solution, even though he said I don't think evolutionary process can answer the question. Then what does answer the question? And it's just, but I get their attempt at, and I think it's good because they do a lot of really good science in that intelligent design movement. Sorry, we were sidebarring on the intelligent design movement and some people on it, which we're gonna, some of that science that they do, we're gonna talk about probably more next Actually, some of it comes in today, some of the stuff we're gonna talk about today. We're gonna get into a common descent and some science that would point to that we are not all descended from a common ancestor, which is the evolutionary theory. And then next week, we're gonna, not next week, no class next week. It's on top of your sheet. No class next week. I'm out of town. Then the following week, we'll probably do the final class, and we'll get into more on can mutation. We're going to start it today, I hope. Can mutation lead to, does it answer the question of how we could have come about through evolution? Can mutation answer that question? We're going to start that today, I hope. So let's go. I'm going to send, I haven't sent this, it's not a sign sheet. It's not an attendance sheet. I'm just looking for people who have come, and if you haven't put your name and email on here, if you could just, let me get a pen. If you could just do so, please. If you're already on there, then nothing to do. All right. There were two things last week that I thought needed a little quick clarification this week. Bill, you had asked about I had shown this chart up here about newly formed rock and the radiometric dating of it. I went back and did a little bit additional research on it. It turns out that they won't start those measurements until the rock has fully solidified. I don't know the exact definition of a solidified rock, is it the structure of the rock, but they have to wait till a certain point before they can take those measurements. But then once they take the measurements, they would apply the same radiometric method that they would use for an old rock. And the assumption would be, because this is a newly formed rock, you should get young ages. And when they do the radiometric dating, they don't. The far right column is the dates that they got when they measured them, even though they know the rock was formed on those dates. So if the argument then is, if the radiometric dating process is correct, I should get a young age. I'm not getting a young age. So is there something wrong with how the radiometric dating process works and the assumptions involved in it? The other clarification I want to make for Mark, tree rings. The longest age that I could come across in looking for tree ring dating was in the 11,000 year mark. And I think last week we were talking about what that date was. So tree ring dating comes to about 11,000 years, which is longer, and that's a dating from evolutionary viewpoint, counting each ring in the trees. Like everything in this discussion of creation and evolution, the evolutionist dates it at 11,000 years. The creationist group says that you can't count every single ring as 1 year. You can have multiple rings formed in a given year, depending upon the weather patterns of that year. You can actually have multiple rings formed, which would give us a younger dating. Again, there's difference in opinions on how you actually view the data and access the data. But the maximum data I found was like 11,000 years.
Where was that from, Jeff?
I mean, it was an
Pretty
article
old.
what's that?
Even that seems pretty old.
I would agree. But I can definitely get the article for you. Yeah. It was in an article that I had read. The creationists date that same tree structure to around 4,600 years. All right. So last time we started talking about the scientific method and how do we actually prove something scientifically. And we walked through, these are the 5 steps. You ask a question, you formulate a hypothesis around that question, you determine a prediction of what might result, determine the logical consequences of your hypothesis, you perform a test to test that hypothesis, and then you look at your test data. Does it support your hypothesis? Does it not support your hypothesis? And then you might revise your prediction and your testing and continue to work through that. But this is the strict scientific method of how we get to a scientific answer on something. I had mentioned last week, but I didn't have a slide about it, that there's another way that scientists look at something being scientifically proven. And that's if there's a consensus view within the scientific community. This is certainly the case within evolution. The vast majority of scientists believe evolution is true. There is a scientific consensus on this. Now, with all scientific theories that are the consensus of a given time, not all scientific theories, but many scientific theories that may be the consensus at one point in time, they can get overturned through time as we learn more and as the science develops and as the maybe the equipment we have and the knowledge we have of things improves, the science updates what we know. And so every scientific revolution starts with a minority scientific viewpoint before it gains popular support and overturns prevailing theory. We talked about a couple of these last week. The view of the Earth being the center of the universe versus the sun being the center of the universe, and there's other examples. And there's many examples. The thing as Christians, we're definitely the minority in the world of not believing evolution. And a couple of guidelines I think to look at is one, that first bullet point, that oftentimes what is viewed as a scientific fact can get overturned over time. Yes?
Wouldn't that depend on the population you're judging? I would say in the scientific community, creation is the minority, but if you were to look at the entire population of the Earth, I would think more people believe in a supernatural creation.
That's probably true. I'm looking at this from the scientific viewpoint, where the scientists' opinion carries the weight, right? So as Christians, the second bullet point is very important. Make sure there is not an alternative interpretation of the Bible that is interpretively reasonable and that resolves the tension. So when we think about evolution, whether we look at Genesis 1 in a 24-hour period or in a long ages period, like we've talked about before, I think it's extremely clear that God created everything, right? That's very clear from the Bible. God created everything, and he created things according to kinds. He created animals, he created the mammals, the birds, and he created them according to their kind. And as Christians, and we talked about presuppositions and worldview early on, this has to be we have to put all of our weight in this, right? Anything we see in the natural world has to be consistent with what we read in Scripture. These are the two revelations from God, right? They have to be consistent. So if we see something that's completely inconsistent with Scripture, we have to immediately, as Christians, say, okay, something's not right here with what I'm being told by the scientific community. And another guideline you can use is, are there scientists out there who, they may be a very small minority, but do they have credentials and do they have reasonable arguments going against what the majority might think? And there are lots of scientists. I passed around the list last week of the 1,000 scientists with, the PhD scientists who's questioned Darwinian evolution. So there are a lot of scientists out there that do question the mechanisms of Darwinian evolution. So just wanted to re-clarify the scientific method and then this consensus view of science. Any questions on those?
If I could just make a quick comment.
Yes, sir.
I agree that science does modify its views as it goes along. But I can't think of an example where kind of a central tenet of a branch of science has ever been overturned. Can you? I mean, there's definitely been plenty of things that have been wrong in the past. But I think really since the modern Enlightenment, so like the main tenet of chemistry is atoms, molecules, this kind of stuff. That's pretty fixed. I think it'd be pretty fair to say the same thing about evolution and biology.
Well, no, I'd say quantum mechanics is
wrapped together.
Mark, I'd say quantum mechanics is they for hundreds of years thought atom was the smallest building block, right? And then they came to understand as the science got further that there's quantum mechanics, right? And there's subparticles.
But they didn't throw out, I mean, they still teach quantum mechanics in school. They didn't throw it out, just modify it. Say, wait, there's more of the story.
Oh, but it's a substantial thing to say that the smallest building block is an atom, right? That is really substantial to say that there's something more consistent deeper down,
And I don't think by questioning evolution we're throwing out biology or we're throwing out chemistry. We're questioning how that's being applied, how that's being interpreted, how we're looking at the data. We're not throwing out cells or DNA.
Yeah.
Right? It's just, what's it really doing in our body and how did it really come about?
But I think that's a misunderstanding then, because that really is a central tenet in biology. I mean, biology doesn't really make sense without the theory of evolution, just like geology doesn't really make sense without plate tectonics. At least as we currently understand it.
Well, I don't know if that's true about biology and evolution from all my reading. I mean, I think biology is very explainable without evolution, which is part of what we're going to start talking about later today and next week, 2 weeks from now.
Okay,
So,
I view that as an unfair comparison, but okay.
Mark's teaching the class that comes after this.
That's right. I'd love to take that one too. That would be great. Patty, did you have a comment?
Just another example, but.
Okay. All right, so last week we talked natural selection. What can natural selection tell us? What can it not tell us? That part on the top is what we looked at last week. Just some summary points again. I'm just reminding people. Natural selection does occur. It's testable, repeatable, observable. We did the dog example on how you can sort out different traits in a dog through natural selection. It's consistent with biblical creation and animals changing within their kinds, right? So dogs will change over time, cats will change over time. Dogs remain dogs though, cats remain cats. They don't change through the process of natural selection itself, and just through the traits within the genetic code, they don't change types. And it is, a big point is the second bullet, that process is a loss of genetic information. Remember this from last time. It's not an increase of information, and the evolutionary process requires an increase of information to go from simple to complex. So natural selection in and of itself cannot be the mechanism for change. Mark had asked about mutations last week. We're going to get to mutations later today. Is that something that could lead to the evolutionary process? I'm going through this quickly because we did it last time. So today I want to get into another aspect of evolution is common descent, and are we all related to one common ancestor if you follow humans back down to a single cell? That's kind of that argument of common descent. I've shown this before. We start as one little thing, and then the diversity of life branches off, and eventually you get everything we have today. And the evolutionary argument, this is what evolution believes and where we all came from. Today, what we're going to look at from a scientific point of view is, do we see this today? And we're going to focus specifically on the fossil record when we look at this today. You could also probably look at other areas, maybe DNA you could look at. Can you trace a common ancestor through DNA? Today we're just going to focus on the fossil record when looking at this. So just to start everybody off, what is a fossil? And it's really just any preserved remain or impression of a once living organism from past geological ages. Fossilization is a fairly rare process, although we do have a lot of fossils, billions of them, but it's still a rare process with the amount of animal life that's been over time. And what they say is we've only got about 5% of living organisms have we found fossils for. So today's living organisms, about 5% of those we found fossils. Fossils.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is that 5% of the type or 5% of the total volume? Because
When you say type, do you mean, are you talking like,
5% of all, 5% of.
I think it's types of, I don't know if it's at the species level or the family level, but types of life, I
The root of my
guess.
question is, we've got 6 billion people currently on the earth.
Yeah.
If 5% of that 6 billion eventually becomes fossilized, we're gonna run out of room on this planet.
No, this is, so that would be like,
species.
that would be one fossil,
Okay.
basically. It would be like a human remain. Yeah. Yeah. Fossils are formed, there's a lot of different chemical processes that result in fossilization. In every case, the fossil needs to be, or the once living organism needs to be buried. There needs to be certain chemical processes that take place over time. And there are different ways that this happens, but the living material gets replaced with other items, minerals and things in the composition as it's buried. And like I said, there's lots of different processes by which they are formed, specific chemical processes, but in general, everything's buried some way or another.
Jeff, the showcase, are there any fossils in there today? Have you looked at it?
No, what showcase, outside of the
Yeah.
great room there?
Right,
I don't, what's in there now?
well, my grandchildren did it, and they got shells from Florida, and,
Oh,
a couple of them look like they're fossils.
okay, I haven't
Take a
looked,
look
I'll
at
have to
it.
take a look, yeah. Okay.
What's the showcase of?
What is the theme of the
Oh, the
showcase?
theme is to think warm, all the cold winter we had, they did all
We could use some warm.
beach and,
It's getting close to warm.
Yep.
So an evolutionary geologist, someone who believes in the evolutionary process, they would view, I think I'm being fair here, Mark, help me if you think I'm not. They would view the fossil record showing, one, it has taken millions of years to develop. One of the things that they look at is the different geological layers, and these are the terms that they use for these Precambrian, Cambrian, and they're ages and layers in the geological record. And what you see generally is at the lowest levels, you see less complex organisms, and at the higher levels, you see more complex organisms. And I don't think anyone really disputes that. And so from an evolutionary standpoint, they say, well, we know these earlier layers are laid down first, and since we only find certain organisms in those earlier layers, then they must have developed first. And then as we move higher up, we see more advanced organisms being fossilized. And so there must have been a progression from less complex to more complex. As we keep going up the geological layers, the complexity of life increases. This is a record of the evolutionary process, right? But it's not looking any deeper than just the fossil record. And so this was observed at one point that there was this fairly uniform progression of fossils throughout the geological layers. I think I just said everything that was on there. And so when you couple this with, originally we didn't have radiometric dating methods, so they didn't know exact ages. This is earlier in the 19th century, right? They didn't know exact ages, but they did know that obviously a lower level is an earlier time frame than a higher level. And even at that time, within the evolutionary community, they viewed you needed long ages for simple organisms to become more complex. So there had to be long ages, although they may not have known the specific ages. Once radiometric dating came in, they were then able to start dating the rock layers, and they were able to say, okay, wow, we're billions of years now. We have kind of a more accurate time frame for this activity. A creationist view of this is that you don't need millions of years to form fossils. Actually, we don't know it takes millions of years to form fossils because we haven't been around millions of years. We haven't been testing for millions of years. So that is really an assumption on the part of evolutionists that it does take that long. We do know that you can form fossils in a matter of years, and even in a matter of days. One of the videos we watched previously had an example of fossils that had been formed in a matter of years. And I have a slide coming up next, or maybe not next, but somewhere that talks an experiment that was recently done with fossilization. We would state that, I say we, creationists would state that the fossil record, while it has that progression, is actually a very logical way that Noah's flood would bury creatures. As the flood starts washing over again, and I have a short video on this that'll explain it in more detail, but as the flood waters rise and as things start to get buried, the same progression you see in the geological layers, as those layers are being laid down, it would lay down the fossils in the order that we see them. This is just a picture showing rapid fossilization. You have one fish. I think this was in one of the videos we watched. you have one fish eating another fish, then obviously that animal was buried very, very rapidly to catch it in that pose.
Jeff, quick question.
Yes, sir.
So, and I don't recall if this was covered before when we watched the Rocks Crab videos. But so I guess one thing that I have a question on is if you assume life as it was on the planet when the flood happened, and so Noah saved a portion of the animals that were on Earth. The rest got killed in the flood. You would expect to have a representative sample, the same animals get off the ark as the ones that were there that got killed, right? I mean, the same species.
Okay.
And yet, when you look at the fossil record, I mean, like you said, only 5% of what we have on the planet today is in the fossil record. Most of this, and I think that's a high number by most accounts, the vast majority of the fossil record, probably more like 99% of it, is stuff that doesn't exist anymore today. How do you explain that?
Well, I don't know if that's true. Getting my pen to write it down.
I mean,
I don't know if that's true.
Dinosaurs are an obvious example, but I mean, most of the stuff in the fossil record, trilobites, crinoids, all the stuff that is obviously identifiable fossil, is stuff that you just don't see anymore.
You see pillows.
Not the same ones that are fossilized. So, like for insects, for example, tons of insects in the fossil record.
Right.
Not the same species that we have today, by and large. I mean, so you have cockroaches in the fossil record, but there's no cockroach species that we recognize today in the fossil record.
Yeah, I think the answer would be that we know things change over time, right? We know natural selection, which we've talked about, things change, and what came off the ark was, we'll go back to dogs, right? The highest level dog, whatever that was at the time, and as things spread and as things were adapting to the post-flood environment, things did change. So what we see today could be different from what literally came off the ark, because you would have had the male, female of that kind, I call it the highest level, because I don't really know any other way to say it, but with the most genetic information for that particular kind coming off, and then breeding, and as they move, they're changing and adapting to their environment through natural selection.
Yeah, and I can see how you would explain, like, okay, cockroaches in the fossil record, cockroaches today, but like dinosaurs, were they? You believe they were on the ark?
I would believe that they were on the ark. They were,
So they went extinct
biblical.
after that?
They went extinct after that. Yeah. They would have been created on day 6 with other land animals. They would have had to have been on the ark. At least some, how many of them, I don't know, right? Depends upon how the kinds work out for dinosaurs, would have had to have been on the ark, and then they would have, the creationist view of the post-flood world is that it's vastly different than the pre-flood world, and that the upheaval of the flood event and the opening of the deep and the whole covering of the entire world with water, and in the aftermath, and it would have created a very different environment that could have caused dinosaurs to go extinct. 1 second, Scott. This is almost fantasy legend lore, but if you look through all of medieval history, there's legends of dragons, and when you look at drawings of dragons, they look like dinosaurs.
And Komodo dragons.
What's that?
And big lizards that we still have today.
Yeah. So I don't think it's totally unreasonable to think that some did survive post-flood. Well, they did survive post-flood, but some survived longer than others after the flood, and that people, had to interact. They were living while dinosaurs were still around, and some of these legends come from that. I don't think it's completely unreasonable.
Okay.
You might think it's
We can
completely
agree to
unreasonable,
disagree.
but again,
I wasn't sure what the thinking was on that from the
yeah,
creation.
creationists would say that they were on the ark, absolutely, and they went extinct afterward. Yeah. Yes.
One thing to keep in mind too, is that there were, all through history, there have been supernatural things that God did for various purposes. And if you look at the fact that after the flood, and even before the flood, humans lived to be hundreds of years old. The Methuselah over 900. Now humans don't live that long. Why? God doesn't explain that, but obviously there was some supernatural involvement there. It stands to reason that after the flood, God might have allowed or done certain things that aren't explained in the Bible to facilitate repopulation of the earth by animals. I'm not saying that's the way it happened, but there's enough things in the Bible that show a difference between what we see now and what was then, that could have been the case. Like, how did all the people come from just Adam and Eve? It's not totally explained, but we believe that God.
If you look at like animals coming off the ark, people coming off the ark, if you look at just normal population models, it's very reasonable that we get to the amount of animals we have today, the number of people we have today, that they could spread throughout. Creationists would say that the splitting of the continent may have been part of the flood, right? So, there was one continent. Plate tectonics is real, to your point, it happens, we know it. But that activity happened as part of the upheaval in the flood, and the continent started to split. So, yeah, Andrea.
I was gonna say, just the atmosphere lent itself to a shorter lifespan. I mean, it was the beginning of global warming. We hear about now how it's bad for us, and yeah, that's what happened right after the flood. The atmosphere changed. There wasn't that canopy, it was like living in Hawaii kind of all the time. So then you had the sun's rays coming in, so yeah, just by virtue of the atmosphere alone, we started living a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, and the Ice Age.
And the seasons, like the food was harder to grow and stuff because you didn't have that tropical season all the time. So the world became a really harsh place after that.
Yeah, there were a lot of changes that came about after the flood. And creationists would say that the flood is what created the Ice Age as well. You've got the heat, you got all this moisture now evaporating off. The splitting of the deep could have been lots of volcanic activity and heating up the oceans. You've got warm oceans, you've got lots of moisture, sun being blocked potentially from volcanic activity, so the Earth's cooling even though you've got moisture. You got tons of snowfall leading to the mini ice age that occurred. That I don't think anybody questions that happened either. Maybe we disagree on the time frame on which it happened, but the fact that there was an ice age, I don't think anybody disagrees with. But yeah, creationists would basically pin a lot of that stuff back to the flood event. All right, so let's see. These are just a couple videos on fossilization. That should be on, is it not? Oh, it must have gone off, it must have timed out. I don't know.
These rarely last more than days or weeks, and hard parts like bones or shells only a month or two. But the rocks of Earth contain billions and billions of fossils, and in many places, millions of fossils are exquisitely preserved, even soft parts. How could this be? To preserve a body, it needs to be put in a safe place. Extremely cold or dry places would protect them, but most organisms don't live in those conditions. There is another solution: rapid burial. If a body is sealed from oxygen and out of reach of burrowing animals, then it has a good chance of fossilizing intact. Rapid burial is uncommon today, but there's much evidence of massive burials in the past. Not only are many fossils well preserved, they're found amidst very fine sediment layers. Fine layers rarely last in the present because all sorts of animals are digging around in the mud and soil, searching for food. In just a few weeks or months, the original layers are destroyed. But in the fossil record, churned up sediments are rare. If these sediments were laid down rapidly, however, they'd prevent burrowers from doing their job. And there are thousands of feet of such layers in the fossil record all over the world. This suggests that moving water laid down mud and sand rapidly over a wide area. And process lasted several months. A year-long global flood, as described in the Bible, is the best explanation we know for the well-preserved fossils and fine layering throughout the rocks of the earth.
And then this, this one talks about the,
Doesn't the order of fossils in the
Yeah,
rock
the order of the
record
fossil
favor
record.
long ages?
Does the order of fossils in the rock record favour long ages? Absolutely not. Let's look at the order in the fossil record. When we go to the lowest layers, we find only marine fossils, shallow water marine invertebrate fossils. And it's only higher in the record that we find the remains of amphibians, then reptiles, and birds and mammals. Now, what does the Bible say? The Bible says that the flood began in the ocean basins. The fountains of the great deep broke open. And that means the ocean floor was ripped apart. You would have generated tsunamis or tidal waves that would have moved towards the ocean, towards the continents. That means they would have ripped up the sediments on the ocean floor, picked up the shallow marine critters, and dumped them up on the continents. And that's exactly what we find in the record. The shallow water marine creatures are buried first. Then as the ocean waters rise higher and higher, they're going to bury the suffocated fish, and then they're going to overwhelm amphibians, and then the reptiles, the mammals, and the birds. It's interesting that we find in the fossil record the footprints of the mammals and the birds, the reptiles, and the amphibians before we actually find the whole critter buried and fossilized. And that fits exactly with what the Bible says about the flood, because these critters, who are quite mobile, unlike the corals that have to stay in one place so they're easily overwhelmed, the fish, well, they sense a certain amount of danger and then they suffocate and get buried. But the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds and the mammals, they can sense danger, they're more mobile, they can move around, and that's what they did. They were running around on wet surfaces.
I don't know why it does every time I
leaving
show
their
this.
footprints, swimming in the waters, leaving more footprints until they finally got overwhelmed by the floodwaters and were buried. Look at the picture another way. If we take habitats on the present Earth, we've got different habitats at different elevations. So at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, for example, we've got a desert environment with cacti. At the top of the Grand Canyon, the south rim, we've got ponderosa pine. Now imagine the flood waters progressively rising, they will progressively bury these different habitats. And so you don't get mixtures, you get these different habitats. And that's exactly what we see. Marine habitats buried first and later land habitats. So the land creatures would have been buried last. And that fits exactly what the Bible says. Does it need long ages? Absolutely not. With the catastrophic global flood as described in the Bible, you have these sediments being ripped up, the creatures being buried and fossilised in an order that fits exactly what the Bible says about the progression of the flood. So, no, the order of the fossils do not favour long ages, but they do fit with the biblical record of the Genesis flood.
So again, depending upon your presuppositions, your worldview, what your starting point is, evolutionists have we're all looking at, I think the next slide.
Doesn't the order of fossils in the rock?
We're all looking at the same fossil record, right? Whatever our presuppositions are, we have the same fossil record. And all we know about what the fossil record tells us is that's where animals were buried. It's not even really where they died. I mean, it might be, but it's really where they were buried and ended up. And we can prove scientifically that you can form fossils in short periods of time. We don't know that it takes millions of years, but maybe it takes millions of years. We do know it can be done in short periods of time. And then the video is just contrasting the standard evolutionary view of how the progression you see through the geologic layers. And again, it's the same data, they're looking at the same stuff, they're just starting from different presuppositions and starting points. This is an article I came across just recently, where it says lab-made fossils cram thousands of years into 24 hours. So this quote on here, fossils are certainly fascinating, but darn things do take rather a long time to form. What if we want to fossilize something as fast as possible? So the assumption is they take a long time to form, but we don't really know that. And then they've been able to go through and recreate it in a laboratory where they created a fossil in 24 hours. So how do we know it takes a long time to form? Certainly it can be done in a short period of time because they've done it, and it's repeatable. So I thought that was kind of funny. They make the assumption it takes a long period of time, and then they show the proof that it can be done in short periods of time. So Darwin, you know, I realized that throughout this, I didn't spend any time really talking about who Charles Darwin was. And I don't know if I should have earlier on, but Charles Darwin is really the one who popularized the theory of evolution through his book, The Origin of Species. There were theories of evolution well before him and long through history, but he's the one who really popularized it and gave it some scientific credibility. And what we would expect to see, going back to this common descent, for all descended from common ancestors, what we would expect to see is some kind of transitional forms through the fossil record as things become from less complex to more complex. We should see that. And Darwin even recognized this as a potential concern. The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on Earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation of every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, in his day, you know, they wrote it off as we don't have enough fossils. We just haven't discovered enough fossil record, and it's true at this point. But he recognized the concern that if we don't see this progression through the fossil record, then it could be an argument against his theory. These are just some other quotes from other famous paleontologists, anthropologists, and the first one is from Richard Dawkins. He's one of the more well-known evolutionists. He says, in fact, for a large number of fossils, a good case can be made that every one of them is an intermediate between something and something else. So Dawkins just looks at the fossil record and says, well, I can put it in, no matter what it looks like, I can put it in somewhere and make it look like it's an intermediate, even if it doesn't show a characteristic potentially that says, hey, this, you know, like from fish coming out of the water. Where is the transition from the fish that somehow develops legs in order for it to come out of water and learns how to, instead of using gills, it can breathe oxygen on land. So his view is just, well, I'm just going to start putting them in and showing that, hey, everything is a transition. Stephen Jay Gould is another, well, he's deceased now, but he was one of the more prominent paleontologists when he was alive. His comment, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Another quote he had was, the absence of fossil evidence for intermediate stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So, and again, an evolutionist paleontologist studying the fossil record, he couldn't find these transitional forms, and he actually came up with a theory to try to explain this that he called punctuated equilibrium. Basically what this means is that you have stages of no change, and then all of a sudden you get a major step function change. So it's like, you know, no change, no change. Oh, all of a sudden you get this change. And then you get this, and then all of a sudden you get this change. And that is what you might see in the fossil record, but that's not what the theory of evolution says. The theory of evolution is you've got this gradual change over time, over time, over time. So it was kind of like a way for him to try to explain what we're actually seeing in the fossil record, but it doesn't fit with evolutionary theory. Yes, sir.
That I heard explained is, if you have a gradual change, let's say you're going from an organism that uses gills to an organism that uses lungs, I would think that you would have a gradual change showing that progression, And then you'd also have to have a progression showing the decrease. So you've got your gills, and then you get your lungs getting bigger and bigger until they finally start being used. And then there'd have to be a transition away where the gills are gradually going away too. Because you would just suddenly have an animal that has lungs and the gills are like gone the next day.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I
there's
mean,
two
for instance, I mean, you
transitions.
should see, however it works, you should see some evidence of that. Now, I mean, an evolutionist would say, look, you're not gonna, fossils are rare, you're not gonna catch all of this detail potentially in the fossil record. And maybe that's true, but we don't see any of the detail in the fossil
And
record.
if I could offer, so going from like gills to lungs, that's like pretty extreme. So if we're talking gradual change, that would not be an example of gradual change. That'd be like, people growing wings. Boy.
But
that
you'd
would,
have to see that gradual change.
Boy, that would be rough.
But that's what they say happens.
But we do see animals that can both live in the water and on land today. But they don't have, I mean, they just have one set of breathing apparatus. It's flexible. So you can do both with it. So I think that's a pretty unfair ask of the fossil record.
Well, so let's go to, I mean, what I always read in evolutionary literature is something along that lines where, well, we see a body part that can do both, breathe in water and on land. And then I have animals that can breathe in water, but where's the in-between? I think that's the point here is you don't see any in-between in any of this progression from a less complex organ type to a more complex organ type. Where's the in-betweens? Regardless of, how big of a gap you want to create, yes. Gills to lungs is a big gap,
You
bring the
definitely
gap
do.
down.
I side with Dawkins on this point. You do. There's tons of transitional forms. It takes a little bit of imagination because the fossil record is, I mean, it's a rare thing to be fossilized. So you don't have these beautiful step-by-step, generation-by-generation portrait, which you wouldn't expect. I mean, yeah, it's not going to be like a video camera of evolution happening if you're just taking random shots of, 1 in a million, 1 in a trillion animals that get fossilized, whatever the number is.
But I should see something.
But why is it more likely that at one point 1 in a million gets captured and
I mean,
1 million not?
And I guess, to this last 2 points here, we don't see transitional forms in living organisms. Now, I understand evolution takes, a long time.
It's kind of like a transitional form if you want to think of it
I
that way.
call that a kind. I understand your point.
You
From
see
an
that?
evolutionary standpoint, you might call that a transitional form. I call an amphibian a kind that's created as an amphibian. I don't see evolutionary change there. But we don't see, if you're going from fish to amphibian or amphibian to reptile, again, within living organisms, should I not see something in between? Even if evolution takes a long, long period of time, I would expect to see some type of change that's still taking place.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Ted.
I would say, doesn't that long period of time make it more likely you would capture? I mean, that's the stuff,
I guess
that's why I'm
that's a
taking
good
it.
argument too. Maybe with long periods of time, maybe you should see something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
because that's
seems
why
like
pretty
it-
much the whole fossil record is species that don't exist anymore.
But what's interesting is
I
you
like
have
that.
the species that existed previously, right, the fish, then you've got the amphibian here, and why didn't some of the transitional phases actually survive, right? So there's a number of steps in between. All of the in-between steps became extinct, but yet you have the precursor and you have the final state. It's a really quite
Let's
interesting.
look at
pretty
the fossil
mathematical.
record. There are a ton of transitional forms.
Of middle level animals, are you talking about the
Yeah,
simplistic?
you're never gonna see something like I say, if you're looking for really extreme things, like we want a fully legged fish, that's ridiculous.
Why is
You
it
can
ridiculous?
fish with little stubs,
Why?
things
I
like
guess
that.
that's where I'm tripping on that one. Why is it ridiculous?
Yeah, that's just not how evolution works. You don't get
So
these-
where are the-
Evolution's a blind process. It
But
doesn't,
it's-
it's not like we have a fish, we want a fish with legs, make that happen.
But at some point, they take that
I don't
first
think
step.
it happened that
No.
quickly. I'm just saying why wouldn't you see the in-between? Why would there not be a capture of the in-between?
There are tons in between, stuff that doesn't exist anymore. That sits in the space between fish and amphibians, or sits
So
in the
why didn't
space
some of the
between
in-between
birds and
survive?
dinosaurs.
Why didn't some of the in-between survive? Why did they
They
have?
do, but we don't call those transitional forms because we call them things like frogs, because it's a it's an animal to us.
But
You never look at something and say, that's a partially formed something or other, because it's a wholly formed, whatever it is. Does that make sense?
So this is the age-old argument, right? And Dawkins is, and I can't say I've read every paleontologist out there, but Dawkins is the one that I've read that says that you can just fit everything into the scale and call everything a transition. I read lots of other paleontologists who admit, and I've got other quotes here that I'm going to probably not do because of time, but of other paleontologists who recognize the challenge that you don't see transitional forms. So yeah.
But wouldn't, now that we're much more scientifically based than 2,000 years ago, wouldn't we be able to tell through DNA that a frog and a fish are not the same?
Or that they have a common ancestry, you know. kind of
Right, or
thing.
that they, or the opposite, yes, that they have a common ancestor. Wouldn't we see that in DNA?
Yeah, and you see commonality in DNA. And an evolutionist would say that that commonality is proof that they've evolved from a common life form. A creationist would say a God who created everything is going to create things similarly with commonality. So I don't know, without getting deep into that science, I don't know how you answer that.
But wouldn't it be more of a transition? Like, we all are made out of oxygen, like all the basics, but wouldn't you see a transition in the DNA itself to make it pattern exactly?
Yeah, and that's actually something we're getting into is the question of mutation.
Okay.
Can genetic mutation lead to the evolutionary process? And I want to get to the start of that today.
So the book I brought in at like the second or third class has some awesome examples of exactly what you're talking about. Where you can say, okay, these two different species have the exact same gene, it's turned off in this one, it's on in this one, and you can see this one's all mutated and broken, this one's not, and then you would assume, okay, common ancestry.
You could say common ancestry. Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
alternative is saying like God creates broken genes and puts them in things, which
No, I don't think
don't
anybody,
think it's beyond that.
nobody argues mutation happens. The question is, and again, this is the whole mutation question I want to get to. The question is, can enough beneficial mutation happen to create diversity of life? That's the question. Yeah, no one questions mutation. We know mutation happens. And actually, I want to try to get to that. Can we hold questions maybe till the end and stay after? This is just more information on the fossil record. This is what they see in the fossil record. There's a point in time, I showed you the layers before. One of them is called Precambrian, another one's called Cambrian. It's just different levels. It's a known for both evolutionists and creationists. In the Cambrian layer, you see a mass amount of fully formed animals at the phylum level, right? So like they've been through the evolutionary process, basically, if you believe in evolution. They've been through that, and they're fully formed, and a whole bunch of them come into being at the Cambrian level. And so part of the question is what happened in the Precambrian level. You know, you should see, if common ancestry is true, you should see, again, this transition from, I've got one, it diverts off, and then this becomes this phylum, and this goes here. But we don't find any of that at the Precambrian level. That fossil record, it's just not there. What they have found at the Precambrian level is these black dots here, and what it shows is it supports that, hey, it's the same as this phylum. You don't see the transitional forms.
So the colored in ones are the ones found.
Other ones found, yeah.
The other ones not.
This is just kind of another way to look at it. You know, this is what they find. This is what you would expect to see from Darwinian theory. This is from a book called Darwin's Doubt. And there's more quotes. All right, I want to get into this quickly. We've got about 5 minutes. So, I'm certainly not an expert on DNA. I'm not a microbiologist. Oh, hey, it's spinning. It wasn't spinning when I was on the phone. Okay, so DNA simply is really just the information storage unit for organisms, right? There are billions of base pairs within humans. You've heard the double helix, right? You've got the picture there. The base pairs are named with G, C, A, and T, which is just for guanine, cytosine, adenine, thymine. And so this is what, the DNA in us is what holds the information for, and it codes for like hair color, eye color, everything about us. So mutations happen, right? Mutations are primarily permanent changes in DNA strand that occur during DNA replication process. It can occur at other times than just DNA replication. Other factors can create mutation. I've listed just a couple of examples of types of mutation. It's not all the types. So again, no one's arguing that mutation occurs within our DNA. Point mutation, I've simplified this. I've taken this out of something I've read. But a point mutation would be if your DNA is cat, then a point mutation as well, the T is mutated and is replaced. That's a point mutation. An inversion mutation, that your DNA may be of this and it gets flipped. Insertion, inserts a whole new segment in your DNA. And then a deletion is you'll lose a part of the DNA. And there's different types of, the mutations can be negative, right? Cell anemia is a negative mutation. It's a mutation in your DNA that causes you to have that disease. And there's all kinds of negative mutations that occur that cause disease or other, other problems. There are mutations that will end up having no impact on an organism. And then there are mutations that convey some survival benefit to that organism. And make the next slide. So looking at positive mutations. One form of positive mutation, one of the methods I've seen referred to as antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Right? Bacteria adapts to antibiotics, becomes resistant to them, so the antibiotic no longer works. And so this bacteria has evolved in the presence of antibiotics, and it's conveyed a positive survival benefit on that.
Can I interject though? In that scope, that's positive for the bacteria, but in the bigger picture, that's negative for humanity.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and it's actually negative for the bacteria, which is what I'm in this specific example. It's negative to the bacteria. So antibiotics work by binding a protein in the bacteria and preventing it from functioning properly. Right? So that the antibiotic does that, the bacteria dies off. Resistant bacteria have a mutation in the DNA in that protein, allowing it to survive in the presence of the antibiotic. So it is absolutely, to that bacteria, it's a positive benefit to that bacteria when it's in the presence of antibiotics. And this is pointed to as a example of evolution and conveying positive survival benefit to that organism. And then as we talk, the process of natural selection then would select that as a positive benefit to the organism, and that would propagate through the organism would survive further using the process of natural selection to select it. Some of the problems with this is that information is actually lost, right? The bacteria has mutated and it is a positive effect for it, but it's lost information again in the process, which again, for evolution to occur, you have to have the increase of information. And that particular bacteria becomes less able to survive in a normal environment that's not with the antibiotic. It becomes less able to compete with the normal bacteria that haven't had that mutation. So while it is an example of a positive change for that bacteria in the environment of antibiotics, it's not adding information to its genetic code. It's actually taking information away. And I think that's all I have for today. So next week I'm going to get into more on mutation and other topics like irreducible complexity. I know that book, because I own that book. I just haven't read that book yet. Wish I had, but I haven't. I know irreducible complexity is in there. I'm hoping to brush up on it before 2 weeks when we come back. Talk about information theory. This is just looking at DNA and mutation, but DNA holds information. Where does the information come from? Did information evolve? We'll talk about that next time. Yes?
I just have a quick question, because I won't be here in 2 weeks, but just going, I don't know, I'm gonna be doing grandparent duties, so that's just as good. The transitional fossil, the transitional thing is always what gets me caught up. So I can kind of see, maybe you can say there's a species that's a transitional species, and like you said, we just call it a frog. But it's the humans that get me, because then it makes it a racist science. Because if you say there's transitional humans, and some humans aren't as evolved as other humans, and I think people over history have used that as
Yeah.
reason.
Eugenics?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely been used. Now, I don't know if the evolutionary scientific community today would say
I
that
wouldn't
that's.
think so, but I think people in
But
history.
throughout history, they've absolutely used it negatively to oppress certain races, right? That's saying that they had evolved on a different level, they weren't as evolved, and it's been used horribly throughout history. But I think it's a logical conclusion.
If you're saying it's happening with animals, then you
Right.
have to be saying it's happening with people.
I think it's a logical conclusion of evolutionary theory, even though I think today people are smart enough to say, no, that can't possibly,
Right.
that's
I
not
think
true.
There are certainly non-evolutionists that are racist as well.
Oh, for sure.
No,
Not- not-
it wasn't,
yeah,
that's in a
it
whole
was
other
just-
topic, but just
for
using
sure.
this.
For sure.
We're not saying evolutionists are racist, we're saying that if evolution never stops, then the human race is evolving still at some pace. And all the 6 billion people,
Some are less evolved than others,
I mean, it's.
at some time or
it's-
another.
yeah, it's a-
And then that can be used as a racist argument, yes.
Yeah, well, that's if you're splitting it down race lines. Of course, there's a lot of other differences, and probably mental capacity would be the biggest thing if you actually wanted to discriminate against a subset of people. And we do that. We have people
Yeah.
take IQ tests and stuff.
Yeah, but, and again, I don't think people do it today, but certainly it's
Oh,
been
we
used.
absolutely do it today. Not in the name of evolution.
Not in the name of, that's my point, not in the name of evolution, yeah. I'm not talking racism in general.
I
In
think
the name of
humans will
evolution.
always discriminate against each other and find people that are different and find ways to
Yes, absolutely, that's true.
make them live a subsistence.
I just want to ask a question about one of the first slides that you had with the picture of the different periods.
Yeah,
I'm a little confused because on it, so you were saying, time-wise?
This
Yeah,
one?
here we go. So,
so these are meant to be different geologic layers.
okay,
And you see in those layers a fossil progression of less complex to more complex.
but did the years come later when they had radiometric data?
Yeah, they put the years on after
Okay.
we had better dating methods.
So the
They would say are
years,
better.
they don't make sense though, because the years are all mixed up, correct? So it says 50 million, then it goes to
Yeah.
30, then it goes to 35, then it
So
goes to 60 to 20.
Timeframe of that particular.
I think that's when this particular group of animals, because here it says 20 million years, earliest land animals. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even look at it that close. You've looked at it more closely than me. I was using it just to show the progression. That's a good question.
Because it's saying.
So 100 million, 75 million, earliest bony fish at 75 million. Then you have, if you look at just fish, right, so you have less developed fish at 75 million, at 60 million, you have more developed fish.
But if you go up higher, it says 72 million years for,
So this is when I guess you would have seen,
I'm
I-
not a geologist, but I think the reason for
I
some
don't
of
have an
the
answer.
overlaps is
Good question.
different land masses. So you've got, and this is a little bit of a guess, but on different continents, you wouldn't call all the same age layers the same stuff because there's different fossils in them. That's why there's some overlap. That's my thinking.
but what I'm saying is the single cell, more simple things are really, should have been 100 million years ago. And we should have more closer, at the top, the more advanced things should be less time, but it doesn't work out that way. That's the only thing.
You're right, looking at, I would agree with you, I'll have to dig into that. I don't have an answer for it.
I was just.
Good
saying-
observation.
But I think that kind of more floats to the whole thing about the flood, where things got swished around, and you can't say younger things.
Yeah, so, let me look into it more, I'll find out, it's a good question. Any other questions?
Lots, but we'll let you go.
Well, I can stick around,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, thanks a lot. So yeah, no class next week. 2 weeks from now, I think will be the last class. It's like,
You think?
well, that's my plan.
Yeah, you know, I think